Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Chof Aleph in Avodah Zarah. We learn for Achenu K'Beis Yisrael and Sun Batzar V'Sivya. From the Mishnah, on the bottom, the last line on daf Chof and Beis. Ein maskir lam batim be'eretz Yisrael be'en tzarich lam masaros. We don't rent to goyim, to Avodah Zarah, houses in Eretz Yisrael, and certainly fields. We'll see why he says certainly fields. Fields have a double meaning, have a double reason why. Now, what does it really mean? You could rent, you could. Technically, you could rent. The kids, we learned yesterday, you can't sell them anything. Why? Because you shouldn't give them those schanim. One of the interpretations of schanim was, don't give them an encampment. Don't let them settle in the land. So if you sell them a house or a field, you're not allowed to do that in Eretz Yisrael. So that's clear. We saw that from the previous Mishnah. You don't sell them any land in Eretz Yisrael, whether it's a house or a field. But here the Mishnah says, Ein maskim, we don't even rent it to them. That's Xera. Xera, you shouldn't rent it to them because you might come to sell it to them. Okay, so you don't rent them a house in Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about over the Avodah Zarah, and certainly not fields. Why fields? Why do they certainly fields? Fields have a double meaning. Why? Because number one, you're giving them a settlement in the land. Number two, they won't give Trumas Amaisras. The land is Chayiv and Trumas Amaisras. If the guy lands, if the guy's on the field, he won't give the Trumas Amaisras. So there's a double reason not to rent to them. Certainly, you can't sell them. That's for sure D'Oraisa. But the Xera Drabanan, you shouldn't rent to them these things lest you come to sell them. What about Syria? Syria, which is we call Syria today, was captured by David. There's a machlokas whether that's part of Eretz Yisrael or not. The Kibush Yachid, since he didn't do that with the agreement of the Sanhedrin, etc., is Kibush Yachid Shmei Kibush, is it part of Eretz Yisrael or not? So the Tanakama says, the Tanakama will see is Rav Meir, who was Syria at the top of Daf Chaf Aleph, Maskir Lam Batim. In Syria, we do rent to them houses. We'll see why. Avalo Saros, not fields. The Gemara is going to explain. We're not gozer because of Mechira. Why? Because even if you sell them a house in Eretz Yisrael, in Syria, it's not a Doraisa. Whereas it says, let's see them Chen Chania, Eretz Yisrael said, the Chashiva Chania, Rashi says, in other words, technically you could sell them a house in Syria, because we go with the idea that the Kibush Yachid is not, it's not really part of Eretz Yisrael. Kibush Yachid losh make Kibush. But we say, so it's therefore Syria, you could rent them a house, because even if you would come to sell them a house, it wouldn't be usher, but not fields, because since they gave Trumas Maisris in Syria also, so we said don't rent them fields lest you come to sell them fields, and if you sell them fields, they won't give Trumas Maisris. Over Chutz, there's three levels. There's Eretz Yisrael, there's Syria, and Chutz La'aretz. Chutz La'aretz means far away, not next door to Eretz Yisrael, but Chutz La'aretz, Mochin Lambat, and you could even sell them houses. No Isser. You could sell them houses. There's no Isser of Los Chanem in Chutz La'aretz. Umaskir and Sados. Still, you don't sell them fields lest you come to sell them a field in Eretz Yisrael. Divra Meir, that's all Rav Meir Shita. That's Rav Meir Shita that he holds away. Rabbi Yossi is more Mekel. Rabbi Yossi says, Eretz Yisrael Maskir and Lembatim. You could rent them houses in Eretz Yisrael. He's not goes there. If you rent them, you might come to sell them. He doesn't hold it Xera. Avalo Sodos, but Sodos which have a double problem. Because why? By a Doraisa in Eretz Yisrael, if you sell them a field, you're over on two things. Number one, Los Chanim, and also you're taking away Trumas Amaisros. Over Syria, he's more Mekel, Mochin Batim. In Eretz, the Tanakama said in Syria, you rent them houses, but you can rent them houses. You're not worried about selling them. Why? Because you technically you can't sell either. But since it's only a Drabanan and Kibush Shachal, so you can rent them. He says you could even sell them houses in Syria. Over Syria, Mochel and Batu, Maskir and Sados. Again, Sados were more machmir because since Eretz Yisrael, it's a double problem with fields. So therefore, you can only rent them, but you can't sell them. Chutz La'aretz Mochel Avelu. The Chutz La'aretz, you can do whatever you want. You can sell them whatever you want. Af Makim Shama Lahaskir. Even though in places where we say you're allowed to be maskir, you're allowed to rent them houses, right? But even where you say you could sell them low the base dira, not to live in. Because they bring their idols in there. If it's your house, you shouldn't, even a place where you're allowed to rent to them, right? You can't rent even the Chutz La'aretz, let's say, according to Rabbi Yossi, where you could rent them your houses, you can rent whatever you want, right? You can rent them both the houses and fields, but don't rent the house that they're going to live in. In other words, only rent them a house that they're going to use for storage, but not they're going to live in. Why? Because they're going to bring idols in there. And the pasuk is lo sovi tovei, don't bring an abomination into your house. Uv'chol makom, wherever you're allowed to sell, lo yaskir lo esabeis hamerchatz. You shouldn't rent out your bathhouse. Meishu nikra shmo, because people will think it's yours, and people say, look, he's hired people. Look, the Friedmans have hired goyim to work their bathhouse on Shabbos. So people will assume that you hired these people, even though you rented it to him and it's technically his usage. People want to know that. People say it's still the Friedman's bathhouse and it's being used on Shabbos. They hired these workers to use it on Shabbos. So you never rent out a bathhouse to anybody, to goyim, because they might come use it. Obviously, you can rent it to a Jew. He's not going to leave it. He's not going to open it on Shabbos. But you can't rent it out to a goy because people will assume that the goy is in your employ on Shabbos. And wherever we say that you're allowed to rent your house, not if the house is going to be used for dwelling purposes, because they bring their idols in there. So whatever the reason is, we're talking about renting houses or fields, the Yisurim involved, because you don't want to come to be over in a doraisa. What's the doraisa? Selling him your house or your field in Eretz Yisrael. That's an Isser of Los Chanem and taking away from Trumas Amaisros. But even when we say there are cases where you're allowed to, like we say in Chutz La'aretz, where you could sell them houses, not if they're used for dwelling purposes, because they're going to bring their idols in there. The question is that you could say Makom Shok Lahaskir. Maybe you could sell them, but you're allowed to rent to them. If you sell him your house in Chutz La'aretz, what's the problem? It's his house now. You can do whatever he wants with it. But if it's your house, you don't want to bring idols in there. So even when we say Af Makom Shok Lahaskir, you're allowed to rent out your house, right? We said Maskim Maskir Mas. We're allowed to, let's say, according to Rav Meir, where you're allowed to rent out your house, let's say in Syria, right? In Syria, where you're allowed to rent out your house, and certainly in Chutz La'aretz you can rent out your house, but not if they're going to bring idols in there because it's your house. But if you sell to them, presumably it wouldn't be a problem. My answer says the Gemara, why do you say that you cannot rent to them houses in Eretz Yisrael, said Rav Meir, and certainly not fields? What's the because fields have two problems. Number one, you're giving him a settlement in the land, because now he won't give meiser, and the land is chayvim from meisers, because we hold that a goy's kinyan in Eretz Yisrael does not take away from the obligation to give trumas meisers. So if you sell him to a goy, if you sell the field to a goy, you're effectively taking away the trumas meisers that field would produce. If that's the case, why are you allowed to the houses also? You say you can't rent them houses because you might come to sell them a house in Eretz Yisrael, and certainly not fields. Why? Because fields got a double isser. There's two there also. If you rent him your house, you might come to sell him your house, which is also los chanim. He's not going to have a mezuzah there. You're taking away from the mezuzah. Famous line that a mezuzah is not chayiv. The house is not chayiv in the mezuzah. The dweller is chayiv in the mezuzah, not the house. So it's not like say, oh, the house used to have a mezuzah, now it doesn't have a mezuzah anymore because you sold it to a goy or rented it to a goy. No, there's no obligation for mezuzah if it's occupied by a goy. So you're not taking it away. Whereas the land is chayiv in trumas meisus, even if the guy is living there, and if you rent it to a guy, he's not going to give trumas meisus. So you're reducing the amount of trumas meisus that will be given to the poor and to the Levium and to the Kohanim, etc. So we said the Surya maskirim batim. In Surya, according to the Tanakama, you can rent them a house. So the Gemara says, you shouldn't sell them a house. Why? Because the Gzeira, if you sell them a house in Chutz La'aretz, in Surya, if you sell them a house, you're over. If you sell them a house rather in Eretz Yisrael, you're over. So we say, why can't you sell them a house in Surya? Because you might come to sell them a house in Eretz Yisrael. You shouldn't be able to rent them a house in Surya either. The answer is he gufik zera. Again, you selling them a house in Surya is only an isser because you might come to sell them in Eretz Yisrael. That's xera. Banan mekim v'nigzer xera. You don't make xera for xera. In other words, you can't sell them a house in Surya because you might come to sell them a house in Eretz Yisrael, which is an isser daraisa. Once we say you can't sell them a house in Syria because of Xera, you can't now say also, let's not rent them a house in Syria because you might come to sell them a house in Syria, which itself is only a Sidrabana. So we're not going to make Xera. What about renting a field in Syria, which is also Xera? Don't rent them a house because you might come to don't rent them a field, you might come to some field because read it, we make Xera there. Hasam lav Xeru. There it's not Xera. Ksavar kivush yachid shmei kivush. He held no, that the Tanakama says that kivush yachid is shmei kivush, meaning the Syrian land is part of Eretz Yisrael. Soda, this Beitarti Soda, which has what? 2 Isurim, both Los Chanim and Meiser. So goes Rabbanan, the Rabbanan made Xera, just like you cannot, in other words, it's Minatorah that you can't sell them a field in Eretz Yisrael, in Syria. So the Rabbanan made Xera, right? Soda, this Beitarti goes Rabbanan, the Rabbanan made Xera, that you cannot what? You cannot sell them a field in you cannot rent them a field in Syria, right? You can't rent. Why? Because selling them a field is a daraisa, because kivush yachid shmei kivush, just like part of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, we said, since there's 2 isurim involved in selling them a field in Syria, the made Xera, you can't rent them a field either. Again, so kivush yachid shmei kivush. So this beitarti is 2 isurim nira Torah. Rabbanan made Xera, don't rent them a field in Syria either. Batim, the less butarti, houses which only have 1 isser. Again, what's the isser? Los chanim. In other words, there's only 1 isser, the araisa of selling them a house in Syria, which is what? Los chanim. There's only 1 isser. Lagazer Rabbanan. The Rabbanan made Xera. The Rabbanan said, you know what? You could rent them a house. Can't sell them a house in Syria, but you could rent them a house. Fields which have 2 isurim, if you were to sell to them, made Xera, don't rent them a house. But Chutzlaretz, what about in Chutzlaretz according to Rav Meir? Rav Meir, he said, Chutzlaretz, you can sell them houses and you can rent them fields, but not sell them, says Rav Meir. Why? Soda, this Beitarti Soda again, which has 2 Isurim in Eretz Yisrael, Gazer Rabbanan, the Rabbanan made Xera, don't rent them a field in Chutzlaretz, which even were you to sell it to them, wouldn't be a problem, because it's Chutzlaretz, right? But Soda, which has 2 Isurim in Eretz Yisrael, we said, don't rent them a field in Chutz La'aretz, right? Lest you come, a soda which has 2 isurim if you were to sell it to him in Eretz Yisrael. So he said, what? You cannot sell them a field in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because you might come to sell them a field in Eretz Yisrael. Again, soda this Beitarte, a soda which has 2 isurim if you were to sell to them in Eretz Yisrael. So in Chutz La'aretz, they made Xera, don't sell them a field in Chutz La'aretz also, according to Rav Meir. Bottom less butar to watch which only 1 isur of los chanim, because Rabbanan. Therefore, they said you can even sell them a house in Chutz La'aretz. However, we said not if it's for dwelling purposes, only if it's for storage. Again, v'chutz la'aretz sadas this betarte because Rabbanan the maskirin v'lo mochem mishum chir Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that's Rav Meir Shapiro who's more machmir. And he says that even in Chutz La'aretz, totally Chutz La'aretz, in New York, whatever, you don't sell fields to goyim because you might to Avdei Avodah Zarah, to Akum, because you might come to sell them a field in Eretz Yisrael. Houses which you also should not sell in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to, but we're allowed to sell them a house in Chutz La'aretz because there's only 1 isur in Eretz Yisrael. So they didn't make Xera on Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so that's what but Chutz La'aretz Sada this Beitarte goes Rabbanan. Button the lowest Beitarte, the less Tarte lowest Rabbanan. Rabbi Yossi Omer says the Gemara at the 2 hours. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Eretz Yisrael Maskir Lebatim. He says in Eretz Yisrael you're allowed to rent them houses. My time. Sodas this Beitarte, Sodas which has 2 isurim as we said, Los Chanim and Meiser goes Rabbanan. The Rabbanan made Xera and said what? You cannot sell them a field, right? Goes Rabbanan. Rashi, what did Rabbi Yossi say in the Mishnah? Eretz Yisrael maskir lem batim avalo sodos. You don't rent them a field. You don't rent them a field. Why? Because since there's 2 isurim in selling them, so we don't rent them. Batim less butar. The batim which only has 1 isur if you sell that to him. Because Rabbanan, therefore, Rabbi Yossi says you're allowed to rent them a house in Eretz Yisrael. As long as they're not used for dwelling purposes, you're allowed to rent them. Selling them would involve one Isur min Torah. Fields, which involves two Isur min Torah, you should not. But you shouldn't rent them field. You shouldn't rent them fields in Eretz Yisrael, because if you sell them a field in Eretz Yisrael, you're over into Isur. Over Surya, Mochamen. Again, Rabbi Yossi is more makel than the Chacham. My time. Why did he say that in Surya? What did Rabbi Yossi say in the Mishnah? Over Surya, Mochamen, you can even sell them a house, maskir, and so you can rent them fields. Rabbi Yossi holds that it's not considered Eretz Yisrael at all. The Sada, this Beitar Sada, which has two Isurim in Eretz Yisrael, goes to Rabbanan. They said what? That Rabbanan said you cannot sell them a field in Surya, because if you sell them Eretz Yisrael, it's two Isurim, but you could rent it to them. Batam Deles Butarti, a house which doesn't have two Isurim in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, he says, look, goes to Rabbanan. The Rabbanan didn't make Gezerah, and you're allowed to sell them a house according to Rabbi Yossi in Surya. Again, Rabbi Yossi is more makel in all aspects, and we pass like Rabbi Yossi. B'chutz la'aretz, and in chutz la'aretz, you could sell them whatever you want. B'chutz la'aretz, mochen elu ba'elu. Again, Rav Meir said that in chutz la'aretz, right, you could sell them houses, and you can only rent them fields. But since there's two Isurim in Eretz Yisrael, you can only rent them in chutz la'aretz. You can't sell them a field in chutz la'aretz. Whereas Rabbi Yossi said in chutz la'aretz, you can do whatever you want. My time, what's his reasoning? Kiva the merchak, since it's far away, look, doesn't make it zera. Amir Shmuel loch Rabbi Yossi. Loch is like Rabbi Yossi is more makel. Rabbi Yossi. So therefore, in chutz la'aretz today, where many Jews live in chutz la'aretz, if there are over the avodah zarah, like in Thailand or wherever they are in the east, where there's over the avodah zarah, you could sell them a house or sell them a field. No worries, except for don't sell them a house in which they're going to bring in idols. Rabbi Yossi. Or don't rent them a house, rather, if they're going to bring in idols. If you sell them, presumably it's no problem. But if it's your house and he's renting your house, you don't want to have idols in your house. Rabbi Yossi. However, don't make it a neighborhood. In other words, don't sell. What's a shchuna? If three people, if you're selling three, even in chutz la'aretz, if you're selling wherever you're allowed to sell, with chutz la'aretz, Rabbi Yossi said, you could sell them, do whatever you want in chutz la'aretz, as long as they don't bring in idols, but don't sell them three. Because if you have a shchuna, if you have already three people living there, you're making a whole neighborhood of Avli Avodah Zarah. What do you worry? You say a Jew is allowed to sell in chutz la'aretz, to sell to a guy, sell him a house, right? But don't make a shchuna, don't sell three. Why aren't you concerned that the Yisrael will sell one field or let's say one big field to an Avodah Zarah, and he'll go sell, let's say he'll divide his field into three, keep 1/3 for himself, and sell the other one to two other goyim. So you will have a shchuna there. And we're commanded one Isur, lifnei velosit michshol. We're not referred to, that's too far to go away. Rashi and Tosas both say this is not really lifnei velosit and michshol, because he doesn't really have an Isur that at all. It's not really a favor. You're allowed to sell to one guy. So there's no lifnei iver over here at all, and that you're worried about the lifnei is going to go further. It's just a way of saying that you don't have to go that far. That kulihai, we're not goes there. That if you sell to one guy, he may divide it up and sell to two more. You will have a shchun of goyim. We don't go that far at all. But the word lifnei iver, lifnei is not really apropos here. It's just as a simon. Right. Even when we say you're allowed to rent your house, which according to Rabbi Yossi, where you're allowed to rent, according to Rabbi Yossi, you're allowed to sell, even the chutz la'aretz you're allowed to sell. And in Surya, what did Rabbi Yossi say? That you're allowed, even in Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to rent them houses if they're used for storage. And in Surya, so Surya, you could sell them, you can rent them fields. Even a place where you're allowed to rent, only not for dwelling purposes, because they might bring idols over there. It's mashma that there are places where you're not allowed to rent. According to Rabbi Yossi, you're always allowed to rent out your house, right? Rabbi Yossi says you're allowed to rent out your house to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. In Surya, you're even allowed to sell it to them, right? So you're allowed to sell them your house. And chutz la'aretz, certainly you could sell them. So we say over here, even a place where you're allowed to rent to them, it's mashma the place where you can't rent. You're not allowed to. And according to Yossi, you're always allowed to rent out your house anywhere, as long as they don't bring in idols. The answer is stomach or meir goes like your base. According to Yossi, you could always rent out. Even in Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to rent out your house to a avodah zarah. So that phrase goes according to Rav Meir. But you should never rent out your wherever you are. You shouldn't rent out your bathhouse. You shouldn't rent out your bathhouse to a guy, because people will see it open on Shabbos and they will assume that the guy is working for you. Tanya, again, the price is similar to the Mishnah. You shouldn't rent out your bathhouse to a goy, because people know it's yours, it's Friedman's, it's Cohen's, whatever. It belongs to the Jew. And the guy is doing malacha on Shabbos and Yantam, and people will presume that you hired him to do this work for you, because people will not know about the rental or the lease. Avalakuti my shari. Can't do it to a guy because he can work for you, but to a kuti. What is a kuti? A kuti is a ger. Rashi even calls him a ger, except they didn't keep all the mitzvahs, right? Like the Samaritans, they didn't keep all the drabanans, etc. They weren't as observant. So a kuti, we're concerned. Remember, like we saw, we're not worried that he's going to commit bestiality. Kutim are not of the avodah zarah. Aval kuti my shar, you're allowed to. Kuti aimer avid melacha b'chol shomai. But a kuti did not. He doesn't hold of the lachos that we learned in Moed Katan, that the rabbis learn out from Sukkim, that Chol is also to do malacha, but a kuti will open a bathhouse on Chol. You say over here, you can't you can't rent your bathhouse to a guy because he'll work it on Shabbos and people will assume he's working for you. And it's mashma that a kuti you're allowed to, but a kuti will open it up on Chol when he holds that there's no isser of that. The answer is, we also open the bathhouse on Chol Moed, not just kutim. Jews do also, because we hold you're allowed to warm it up. That's a tzorach hachag, it's a tzorach hamoed, that you're allowed to warm up heat up the bathhouse to have hot water on Chol Moed, so there's no problem there. Aval sadeu, but your field, love the chav ma'ishari. Again, you shouldn't rent out your beis hamerchas, your bathhouse. You shouldn't rent out to a guy, but a field you could rent to a guy. A field you could. My shari, my time. What's the reason? Arisa's a covet, because people will assume that he's just a sharecropper. People will not say he's working for you. If he works on Shabbos or Yontif, people will assume he's a sharecropper. He's doing his own. My time. Arisa's a covet. So if that's the case, Merchatz Nami Amri Arisa. So why can't you rent out your bathhouse also? People will say that he's just a sharecropper. He's got a share in the profits of the bathhouse. The answer is Arisa the Merchatz Lo Abdi and she. Tanakam holds that people don't rent out a bathhouse on as a sharecropper, meaning he gets a percentage, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the income. He keeps. They don't do that. They do it with fields where they're going to get crops. They don't do that with bathhouses. So therefore, he says that you're allowed to where you're allowed to rent out your field, which according to Rav Meir, that's not in Eretz Yisrael because there's double isra there, right? B'chutz la'aretz, you could rent out your field, right? And in Syria, Eretz Yisrael and Syria, according to Rav Meir, you don't rent out the field. B'chutz la'aretz, you could rent out the field. According to Rav Yossi, you could even according to Rav Yossi, you don't rent out your field to goyim, but in Syria and Chutz la'aretz you can, right? So he says even there you're allowed to. In other words, where you're allowed to. There's no concern about. People will say that the guy is working your land on Shabbos, but people assume that he's a sharecropper. Tanya, the first of the wide lines. Lo yaskir sadeu lekuti. You should not rent your field to a kuti nikr sal shmo, because people will think it's yours, not his. Lekuti zeh osa melacha b'chol shemoy. He does work on cholamoy. Now, what's the problem with the cholamoy? But the bathhouse, we said that you're allowed to. Why? Because we also could work on cholamoy. But your field, we don't work fields on cholamoy. We will open a bathhouse. We'll heat up a bathhouse on cholamoy. So if a kuti does that, no problem with that. So you could rent out your bathhouse to a kuti with no concern about that. Maybe he's going to work on a cholamoy because we also do that. But you don't rent your field to a kuti because people will think that it's yours and that he's working your field on cholamoy. Why do you say? Rav Shapiro says you can't rent out your field to a kuti because people assume that it's yours and he's working your field on cholamoy, which we don't do. You're allowed to. Why? the Amri Arusa, but because they say he's a sharecropper, so he'll also say he's a sharecropper doing his own work. What's the problem, Arusa? He'll also say that he's a sharecropper doing his sharecropping work. The answer is Rav Shimon Elazar holds, the author of this brisa, Arisusa Rav Shimon Elazar Lesley. He doesn't hold to that. He doesn't hold that excuse that people think he's a sharecropper or not. People will assume that he's yours, that it's yours. In other words, don't rent your field to a kuti because he's going to do work with them in Chol Hamoed, and people assume he's working for you. So wait a minute, but you're allowed to rent it out to a goy? The goy people assume the guy's also doing work for you. So if that's the case, why is it a mutter? If you can't rent your field to a kuti because he'd be doing work for you on Shabbos, and people will assume that he's going to work with them on Chol Hamoed, people think it's yours. So if also, why is that mutter? We say. Because we tell him Vitzayas. If you tell a guy, listen, I'm renting you the field, but you can't work on Chol Hamoed because people will think you're working for me. Can't do that. He'll listen to you. Kuti nami amrina levitzayas. So why can't you tell the kuti and he'll listen to you? Kuti lotzayas. This is worse. The worst kind is a non-observant Jew, because kuti lotzayas, he won't listen to you. The Amr, he'll say, Ana gemir netayminach, I know better than you. In other words, they'll have these kind of a Jew who thinks, I know halacha better than you. A guy, you tell him you can't work the field. I have to be closed on Chol Hamoed. He'll listen to you. A kuti won't listen to you. Yachi, if that's the case, my iram nation ikrasal shmo. Shmuel Elazar says, don't rent your field to a kuti because it's going to be called by your name. People think it's your field, and he's going to do work on Chol Hamoed. That's a reason nation shmo because he's a Jew. Kuti's also a Jew, and if you rent him your field, he's going to work on a Chol Hamoed. You're over because you know he's going to work the field on Chol Hamoed. The answer is right. Both reasons are valid. Two reasons here. It's one reason and another reason. Because if you rent your field to a Kuti, he's going to work on Chol Hamoed, which is Asur, and he doesn't think it's Asur. Because people will think that you hired him. Whereas if you rent it to a guy, we're talking about a place where you're allowed to rent it to a guy, right? Not your field in Eretz Yisrael, according to Rav Meir, and according to Rav Yossi, in Eretz Yisrael, both even according to Rav Yossi, you don't rent your field in Eretz Yisrael, but in Syria you're allowed to, and according to Rav Meir, in Chutz La'aretz you're allowed to. So when you rent out your field where you're allowed to rent out your field to an Avodah Zarah, you still cannot rent. You can never rent out your field to a kuti because he's going to work with them on Chol Hamoed, and you're going to be over in Lefnei V'Lasid Meshra because he's not going to listen to you when he say you can't do work on Chol Hamoed. He's going to say you could do work on Chol Hamoed, and also people will think that it's yours and he's working for you. So both those reasons are valid. Now we come to an inyan when you have workers working for you and there's an issue of Shabbos, etc. What's the deal? So the Gemara tells us a story like this: Hani Murukai, there were some saffron workers. In other words, a Jew and a goy went into a partnership. They took a field. Let's say they hired a field either as sharecroppers or whatever. But the two of them did this together: a goy and a Jew. The guy worked on Shabbos. This has been an age-old solution for people who have businesses which whatever have to be open on Shabbos for whatever reason. We used to have this in the computers. We used to have to run the computers 24/7, and we had a problem. It's a Jewish-owned business, and what do you do on Shabbos? Of course, you don't have Jews working there. But what about, aren't you making the profits? He's working for you on Shabbos. How's your place open on Shabbos? Right? If somebody would have a kosher bakery and it's open on Shabbos, people won't think it's kosher, right? But there are big businesses which cannot stop on Shabbos. So what do? So here's an example. They had the saffron workers. The guy worked on Shabbos, and Yisrael b'chab Shabso, and they said, "Is that a valid arrangement? Can you do that?" Also, they came before Rava. Sharalahu, he allowed them to do that. Said that's okay. You're allowed to do that. Meaning the guy gets the profits on Shabbos, and you get the profits on Sunday. Let's say the rest of the week they share it equally. But the Jew works on Sunday, and the guy, let's say, goes to church on Sunday. He takes off on Sunday, and the Jew works on, and the guy works on Shabbos. Ace Ravina Rava. So Ravina asks a kasha on Rava from the following case. Listen to this: Yisrael and a guy, again, a guy and a Jew, took a field to work at b'shutvis on an arrangement, but they didn't say up front, listen, on Shabbos, it's yours. The Jew would say on Shabbos, it's yours. I have nothing to do here on Shabbos. Shabbos, the business is yours. On Sunday, the business is mine. He didn't do that. If he did that, that would be okay. But what he didn't do, they just said, okay, we're accepting it together. And then it's understood that the guy works on Shabbos and the Jew works on Sunday. So, lo yomer Yisrael v'chavim. The Jew cannot tell the guy, Tul chelka b'Shabbos, you take your share on Shabbos and I get my share on Sunday. Why? Because when he says you take your share on Shabbos, it's like saying him, you work for me on Shabbos and I'll work for you on Sunday. And the guy can't work for the Jew on Shabbos. And the Jew could work for the guy on Sunday. But when he's effectively telling the guy, you work for me on Shabbos, we'll split it, but you do the work. So you work my share on Shabbos and I'll work your half on Sunday, right? They're supposed to do everything 50-50. So he tells him, you work for me on Shabbos and I'll work for you on Sunday. That's no good because he's telling the guy to work for him on Shabbos. Lo Yomer Yisrael v'Tul Chelka, you take your share on Shabbos, meaning you get what you take all the share, you get my share also. You work for me on Shabbos and take everything. If they made a deal up front, listen, we're doing a partnership over here, but on Shabbos, I have no say. I don't own the business on Shabbos. You own it on Shabbos and I own it on Sunday. That's okay. That's okay. And that's not how they have a teirim for that. I remember we drew up a contract with an Italian guy who was working for us, and we went to Rav Feinstein in America, and that's what he says. He says you give him a share, you give him a little extra money on his salary, and you tell him that's what he gets for the profits on Shabbos. It's not really figuring it out mathematically what the profits are, because it's almost impossible to figure out the profits in an operating room where you can't attribute the profits directly to what's going on Shabbos there. But you make a deal like that. So in Hisna Mitchila, if they made a condition like that up front, you work on Shabbos and I'll work on Sunday, right? Rashi says, take a look at Rashi. Before anybody started working, before they had the obligation to work, mutter the lo kibala Yisrael avodas the Shabbos. The Jew never took upon himself the work on Shabbos. In other words, he didn't say you work for me on Shabbos. He says I have nothing to do here on Shabbos, and you have nothing to do on Sunday. Then it's mutter.
So this the going can then sell the juice or
on Shabbos, because the whole thing belongs to on Shabbos. The whole thing belongs to the guy. So he can do whatever he wants. But if they didn't do that, no, they didn't say this up front. He just says, listen, okay, we took the whole thing b'shutfus. The fact is the guy worked on Shabbos, I worked on Sunday. Let's try to make a cheshbon now, how much I owe you for Shabbos and how much you owe me for Sunday. That means that the guy did work for the Jew on Shabbos. That's usher. So Ravina asked us, Kasha Rava, you were matter these saffron workers, where they had this arrangement of the guy working on Shabbos and the working on Sunday. You said it's mutter. It says that the price over here says that's only mutter if they made a deal up front. But if they didn't make a deal up front, they just said, okay, listen, whatever happened on Shabbos, you work for me and I work for you. That's no good. Ichsab. So we have this many places. So Rava was embarrassed. He was embarrassed. But then later on, it turned out that it wasn't a problem. Why? That in that case where the saffron workers came to Rava, they did make that condition up front. They just said the Jews said, "Listen, I don't work on Shabbos. Shabbos, it's all yours. Sunday, it's all mine." Then it's okay. You have this many places in Shas where Rava seemed to have made a mistake and then he got embarrassed, and it turned out he had siyata d'shmaya. It worked out okay. Rav Gavia rather from that town, Beiksil, said the story was different. Amru Hanu Shetile de Arlahavu. It wasn't the problem of Shabbos at all. See, a guy cannot work for you on Shabbos, right? You can't have your business open on Shabbos unless you have an arrangement. It's not yours on Shabbos. On Shabbos, that's his, and on Sunday, it's yours. He can't work for you. He says it wasn't even an issue of Shabbos, of a guy working Shabbos. Rather, these were plants of Arla. Now, what's the deal of Arla? If you have a tree, a sapling, first 3 years, you can't eat the fruits. Now you're allowed to work the tree. You're allowed to, whatever you have to do to prune it, to, give it water, sustain it. You're allowed to. They just can't eat the fruits the first 3 years. In the fourth year, it's like in Netrava, you got to take there. It's Yisrael to Yerushalayim. So this wasn't a case of Shabbos at all. It was Arla of the Chavim Achol Shei Arla. So he made like this. Listen, we bought a tree together. the first 3 years, the Jew can't eat it. So he says to the guy, you take the first 3 years and I'll take years 4, 5, and 6. And he's not getting a no because he's saying that's yours. Yours is the first 3 years. Mine's the second 3 years. The Yisrael took 3 years against the first 3 years. He took 3 years, 4, 5, and 6 years he was allowed to. So also came in Rav. They came for Rav. Is that okay? Surely he was matter. So according to this, why would there have been a problem of what he said, making a shitfus up front? There was no problem with the guy working for you. The problem is if it's Shabbos, the guy can't work for you on Shabbos. But over here, where the guy worked the first 3 years and the Jew worked in years 4, 5, and 6, there's no problem because a guy could work for you on your field. You just can't eat the fruits. You can't have enough from the fruits. So what was, if that's the case, if the story was with not saffron workers, but with these with the problem of Shabbos, but rather a problem of Arla, there's no problem. The guy could work for you on Arla also. There's no problem for a guy working your tree on during the first 3 years. The problem is only you can't have enough from the fruits. So what was Ravina's kasha Rava? The answer is he wasn't as kasha at all. He's trying to bring a proof for him. Just like on Shabbos, when the guy's not working for you because you said up front, listen, Shabbos, it's yours, and Sunday, it's mine. Up front, you made that deal. You never had a share in Shabbos. He wasn't working for you on Shabbos. Just like that's mutter. When there's no problem of melacha, there's no problem over here also melacha because there's no Shabbos, there's no issue of Shabbos when it comes to Arla. So he's bringing a proof. So why was Rava embarrassed the way we said the story? Never happened. Rava was never embarrassed by this. Just the opposite. Ravina got the story wrong. Not that Ravina asked Kashem Rava from Shabbos, but rather, and then Rava was embarrassed, but it turned out it was okay because they made the deal up front. No, rather the whole story was with Arla. And since there's no problem for the guy working for you with Arla, so he's bringing a proof. Just like by Shabbos, if there's no problem because you made a deal up front, there's no problem with the melacha. There's no problem here also. And Rava was never embarrassed. But what happens if you didn't make a deal up front? We said before, if you didn't make a deal up front, and he tells him afterwards, listen, you work for me on Shabbos, so we'll split up that money. And then I work for you on Sunday, we'll split up that. That's not good. What happens if he didn't say anything, you work for me on Shabbos? Stam, they didn't say anything. It was understood. Everybody knew that, this guy's a Shabbos guy and this guy and we work on Sunday, they work on Shabbos. He said, it's stam. You didn't make up anything at all. Rashi says before the end of the parak, stam amai, shikabu stam. But also stam, avikam b'Shabbos v'Yisrael b'chab b'Shabbos. V'larma Yisrael me'olam. He didn't say, listen, you take your share. Tulat, you take Shabbos because you work for me on Shabbos, and I'll take the Sundays because I work for you on Sunday. Can they split it that way? Don't mention Shabbos at all. Can it just be understood that way? So Tashma, we're going to bring a proof from that brisa. If you made a condition up front, Shabbos is yours and Sunday is mine, but we're not working for me. We're not working for each other. Shabbos it all belongs to you and Sunday is mine. That's mutter. Hastam is mashma. If you didn't say that, it's usher. But the safe is the same as safer the other way around. Imbol lecheshman. If you come to make a cheshman, he says, well, listen, you worked on Shabbos, so you take this share. You worked on Shabbos for me, so therefore you should get all of the Shabbos is paid, and I worked on Sunday for you. That's usher. Hastam is mashma mutter. Elam like mashma. You can't prove anything from the brisa to this question. If you stam, you didn't say anything. You didn't say Shabbos you worked for me and Sunday I worked for you. Can they split it equally? And assume that there's no isser of the guy working for the guy on Shabbos or not, that question is not resolved. And we'll start the new parak, and we'll start the second parak tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody. Kol tuv.
Didn't realize that you were